Okay, great. Good morning, everybody. Vidhya, I want to start by talking about how you got into this line of work. So you started as an anti-racism activist. How did you decide that starting a business was really the best way to tackle this problem?
Well, when I entered the anti-racism sector, if it is a sector, when I started doing activism on this issue, I'd come at it from a very personal perspective, growing up as the kid of Indian immigrants in the US and growing up in a part of the US which was very white. There weren't that many dark faces in the community where I went to school. I spent a lot of time feeling really ashamed about my skin color and about my parents' background. It took me many years before I really embraced my cultural heritage, embraced my own skin, and started to feel comfortable in my own skin. So, it wasn't new to me when I entered the anti-racism space, the idea of thinking about how people come to feel comfort and power in their own skin color, and how they start to associate worth with different types of skin color. I started thinking a lot about white nationalist movements, how it is that people come to feel about dark-skinned people, that they shouldn't be here, that they shouldn't be in our communities. And when I joined anti-racism activist groups, I felt a mixture of empowerment and also frustration. I felt empowered on the one hand because I was part of a community that was really focused on pushing forward progressive values and that understood the experiences that people like me had grown up with. However, I felt frustration because there were so few people around me that seemed willing to actually engage with anyone who was in one of these movements, a white nationalist movement, a neo-Nazi movement, an anti-immigrant movement. There was a lot of galvanizing of the great and the good, people who already believed in our cause, but very little crossing that boundary and talking to the other. So
you did that.
I did do that.
Tell us a little bit about that.
I embarked on what was a 2-year mission of mine to start conversations with white nationalists. It was probably one of the most bizarre experiences I have ever had in my life. I started simply by attending their rallies, turning up as the Indian woman that was standing in the back and just observing. Started asking them questions, just walking up to them and asking them who they were, why they were there, what they believed, and why they believed this was the best course of action. And oddly enough, they were very open and receptive to talking to me. It surprised me as well. I spent 2 years getting to know people in the movement.
And you were in Sweden at the...
I was in Sweden,
okay.
Yeah. I had been fascinated by Scandinavia for many years as a child and spent some time living there. And I was in Sweden. I had learned Swedish at that stage and taught myself Swedish to undertake this project. And I got to know people in the movement. Soon they were inviting me into their homes to meet their wives, to meet their kids. For me, that was a pivotal moment in my career because it really did transform my understanding about people who get involved in these sorts of movements. It's very easy to think of people who get involved in extremist organizations as being monsters. We can't understand them. And what I realized is that actually these are human beings. They're human beings. They have very real stories as to why they've gotten there. And they also can change. They're capable of change. And unless we grant them that possibility to change, then we're doomed as a society if we believe that anyone who gets involved in horrible activities can't change. So that kind of power of change and granting people the right to change is what has driven my work since then. And certainly in starting a company, so we set up Moonshot CVE with a co-founder 3 years ago. And we set up the organization largely because I saw that I was in an industry that was working on very risky issues. I mean, we're talking about everything from neo-Nazi groups to ISIS. These are risky subjects to be working on. But we're in a very risk-averse sector, and it's a strange dichotomy because governments on the one hand can't necessarily take all the risks that they need to take in order to act because they have other interests. And there's a huge charity sector, not-for-profit scene that is working on these issues, but they're oftentimes bound by charity boards. They can't necessarily innovate. And these groups are innovating on a daily basis. So we need innovation in order to respond. And that's why we set up a company with a for-profit for-profit model, we essentially use our profits to reinvest in our own risk-taking, our own pilot testing, our own creation of new software and responses in the online space.
So yeah, explain to us how Moonshot works. What's the business model? How do you actually operate in this field?
So our funding comes from a mixture of sources. We work not only with governments, and we work with the domestic and the foreign arm of governments. We also work with tech companies and with the private sector. So major partnerships with companies like Google, with Twitter, with Facebook. And for us, our core funding comes from our main service delivery work. What we're doing is to enhance the ability of those clients to be able to effectively respond to terrorism in the online space through creation of new software which can be adapted and applied on their platforms, creation of tools that allows us to automate the process of identifying individuals who are getting involved in these groups in the online space, and then efforts to actually reach out and engage those individuals in the online space, to start conversations with them, offer them alternative options, disrupt their organization in the online space in some cases. And that's our core business. But then any profit we then reinvest in our own development of new software, the trial testing of methods which nobody else will be willing to fund yet because it's just too risky and we haven't gotten proof of concept yet. But if we invest in it ourselves, we'll be able to get that proof of concept and then scale it out with partners across the world.
So can you give us an example of what this actually looks like? So for example, you work with Google. How does this actually work?
So our partnership with Google started just about 2 years ago. Google's technology incubator called Jigsaw approached us and basically wanted to start an open conversation about how we might deal with the fact that terrorist organizations were using their search engine to both disseminate propaganda, but then also they were very aware that individuals were using Google to search for extremist content. So we started basically at the beginning. We started with a blank slate and worked through, well, how can we use the existing infrastructure of Google search to try and reach people who are getting involved in this? And actually, the answer was very simple. It was simple in the first instance, and now we've complicated it from there. But in the first instance, it was advertising. We thought, you know what? Nike uses advertising to reach people who are searching for a new pair of sneakers. Coca-Cola uses it to reach people who are searching for information about soda. And people who are searching for information about joining or getting involved in a terrorist organization, can we not use advertising, a very simple commercial method, to reach them? What we realized is that actually, if we're going to reach them through that mechanism, what are we going to reach them with? What kinds of content can be put in front of somebody who's vulnerable to try and change their minds? And we did some scoping work looking at video content across the globe and digital content across the globe, and realized that there's actually a huge amount of content out there that's been created by local community organizations, or even just the guy on the iPhone who's videoing himself, or a video that a grandmother has taken in her own home. Videos that are created by the communities around us, but they don't get put in front of the people who need to see them. So we developed this partnership with Google to create a methodology called the redirect method. It's a methodology that uses the simple power of advertising to reach anyone who's searching for information about how to join the KKK, how to join ISIS, how to download propaganda from terrorist organizations. And we ensure that we are the first piece of content they see. We run advertisements against those search terms, and we reach them with content that's been specially curated from across the globe, content that's been created by citizens, by communities around us, and curates that and places it in front of that person who's at risk.
How do you measure if it's effective? How do you know if you're actually changing someone's mind?
That's a great question. The online space offers so much possibility for us to not only identify people who are getting involved in these movements, but also then understand whether or not we're having an impact. And I think we tend to think of the online space as being very scary, partially because there are such abusive behaviors being demonstrated in the online space. Yesterday we heard the experiences of Laura Boldrini, really horrific stuff. And at the same time, we also are living in a post-Cambridge Analytica era where we are all very aware of how data can be misused and abused. Now, in the online space, it's also an opportunity for us to make good use of publicly available information to piece together a puzzle around individuals that are leaving us clues, letting us know that they're getting involved in these sorts of behaviors. Every single person who is engaging with extremist content online, unless they are incredibly clued up about their own kind of digital privacy, and in many cases they're not, unless they're very clued up, they oftentimes leave behind a trail of clues. It's a digital footprint that lets us know they're getting involved in this sort of activity. Now, we can use that not only to analyze them as a kind of audience and try and understand them, not only to reach them, but also then to track our impact once we have offered them an alternative form of content, once we've engaged with them in a conversation in the online space. So, there's so much opportunity to do evaluation of your work in the online space. It's quite exciting.
Great. I'm going to open up to questions. I think we've got one right here in the front. Great.
Hi, Alex Schwartz from Hacklet. I hear what you're doing is very admirable, and you're countering this by offering positive content. What do you make of censoring content? So I think I read a year or two ago, Google was editing search results for, when you search the Holocaust, they would remove websites that denied that it existed. What do you make of that as a method to countering extremism?
It's a great question. Content that is illegal should, in my view, 100% be taken down. Content that is illegal. Now, most of the violent content that gets posted online is not actually illegal. So that leaves us in a tricky situation because on the one hand, you could be very much in favor of taking down content, but we're not gonna get everything taken down just within the bounds of focusing on illegal content. And if we tread beyond illegal content, that's where we get into the realm of censorship, and that's very worrying. The pace at which violent content is posted to the internet it's unbelievable. It's very difficult for us to match through new technologies, and there are companies out there that are focusing on automating the process of identifying content that is, demeaning towards women or that, has beheading in it and things like that. I am very much in support of efforts to scale up takedown efforts for illegal content, but for the content that is still there and which we just haven't been able to match the pace to be able to take it down. But then secondly, for the content that isn't illegal and that doesn't warrant a takedown, we need to make sure we're making better use of publicly available data around that content to find not only users who are posting it, but also users who are engaging it, who are seeking it out, and try and offer them alternatives. I believe it's kind of our duty as citizens in a new digital era.
Do we have any other? We have a question right at the back there. Thanks.
Yep. Minagero and CNH. What do you do when what you find on these terrorist sites or leads to trails of terrorist funding? Who do you report it to?
So we haven't actually yet stumbled upon cases of terrorist financing. We have stumbled upon cases of individuals where we believe they are planning something, and we do report them to the relevant authority. We don't serve as an intelligence function, and we make it very clear we're not doing actionable intelligence. But as and when we do come across something which we believe to be an imminent threat, we will report that to local authorities, and we will usually, in any country that we're operating, and we do this work across over 20 countries, we will have an appropriate mechanism with either local law enforcement or another relevant local contact to be able to flag that and raise it if it is of concern.
I think we had a question right here.
Jana Hainsworth from Eurochild. I'm interested that you have many different experiences in different contexts. So you've been in academia, you've also been at EU level. I wondered if you could give me some examples from the perspective of government and civil society, where you think they are playing the best possible role that they can play in tackling hatred and violence and terrorism, because it's clearly you need to work in partnership. I think we all have a role to play.
Right. Yeah, it's a good question, and I think there's a lot of scaremongering about the role of government plays. There's a lot of scaremongering around the role that civil society or non-governmental organizations play on this issue. I think government does have a role to play, and particularly around the legal instruments for recognizing and also having appropriate response mechanisms for terrorism. That's where government needs to firm up its responses. As somebody who has spent nearly a decade now working on advocacy on far-right violence, which is a systematically underestimated and under-recognized form of terrorism, that is an area that governments still across the board don't necessarily have in place the legal instruments to even be able to convict people of terrorist charges when they've been involved in the far right. There is a role for government to play there. When it comes to doing social work and preventative social work, there is essentially what we need to be doing here is we need to be taking a social work perspective to an issue that has been heavily securitized. And there's a risk when government is the sole entity that is doing preventative direct engagement work with people at risk, that it becomes securitized just purely because of the nature of government's position on these issues. There is a real need for independent bodies who come at this with social work training and from a social work perspective, who have a line into the relevant authority as and when things go wrong, as any other social worker would who is engaging directly with a vulnerable, potentially destructive individual. For us, when we do this work in the online space, we are treading into a number of different environments. One is the digital environment, the other is the social work environment, and then obviously there's the kind of intelligence and security community that sits to the side. We very much want to be in the digital and the social work space, but we cannot do our work effectively unless we have a mechanism in which, if something goes wrong, we can flag it to the relative authority. So these entities all need to work together, but there's a home for each of them, and it's about finding the right home.
What are the parallels that you see across different extremist groups? What are sort of the commonalities here?
Extremist groups are actually far more similar to one another than we believe they are. And I always say there are as many pathways into a terrorist organization as there are terrorists in the world. I have worked now with hundreds of former extremists, former terrorists from across the spectrum, whether we're talking about Al-Qaeda, jihadist movements, neo-Nazi movements, Irish dissident republicanist movements. And it is remarkable the similarities that you hear in the stories of individuals that have entered into these movements and have come out the other end. Very similar themes around the experiences, the life experiences that push them to get involved. Very similar motivations for joining a group. We oftentimes see individuals who believe that they have been victimized and believe that they had no chance in life, and this group offered them power. This group brought to them a sense of meaning, made them feel protected when they felt like they were alone. Those themes carry across extremist organizations. Now, obviously, in any country, everything is going to be context dependent. There are some parts of the world where extremist organizations are recruiting individuals simply by offering them jobs when they are living in poverty, going to families and saying, we'll take your son and we'll employ him as part of the terrorist organization. That's very different from a context, for example, in America, when we're talking about neo-Nazi movements. These movements are very much focused on ideology and on pulling people together in a sense of belonging rather than necessarily offering a job. So obviously there are differences based on the geographical context, but what we find is that the underlying drivers are very similar, and also the turning points that get people out of movements are very similar. Oftentimes people stuck in these movements are just that, they're stuck. Once you've entered into a terrorist organization, you have oftentimes alienated yourself from your whole family, from your community. You are stigmatized. You have nowhere else to go. And so if we approach the prevention of terrorism from the same perspective across terrorist organizations, we can actually start to scale up efforts to do this. And that's where in the online space, it gets very exciting because we have now developed technology which allows us to identify at scale people getting involved not only in groups like Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, but also neo-Nazi movements, eco-fascist movements, Hindu nationalist extremist movements across the world. We're we're basically delivering the same methodology in over 20 countries. And what we find is that there's very similar trends in the way that they engage online and very similar ways for us to get people out.
Well, we are sadly out of time. This is fascinating work, Vidhya. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks.